Um, so I want to give an update on the things that we worked on in the last few months. You know that I've been working on a specific artifacts with respect to third order shim and so on. So basically, this is an update. And um, some of you might think it's weird. Like I'm not a gradient expert, and I don't really care about gradients, but I think I need to some degree to fulfill the goal of kind of getting towards whole brain layer fMRI. And as you know, what the stuff I do care about is VESO, which took us like 4 or 5 years to get from the sequence to the artifacts, making more than a single slice method and validation and so on. And I care about layers, which also took us at least 4 years to get the contrast right, get the readout right, have it analysis software until it was kind of a stable product. So since the last few years, I'm really trying to get whole brain layer dependent fMRI to look at connectivity, including also the lower and deeper brain structures, which again was difficult because we had to get the functional contrast right and get better signal quality, specifically in the lower brain areas, and then also avoid these noise amplifications in the center of the brain. And still, I'm not really there yet. And I think that the stuff that's keeping me from it, the bottleneck, are these short-term gradient imperfections that make it so hard. So let's look into the struggles that we had so far. So in the first iteration of doing whole brain, it was mostly the TR that neuroscientists didn't like. You can do a lot of stuff with those kind of TRs, but it's still a large price to pay. And like to get these many slices, like in the range of 200 or so in a reasonable TR. Then the next issue that we had were these artifacts, specifically in the low brain structures that come along when you have a 3D EPI with very long readout durations that are as long as the respiration cycles. And then also we have this G-factor noise amplification. And then when you look at all these struggles, it kind of all comes down to grappa. Because if we would be able to do more grappa, then we would have shorter TRs, right? We could skip more k-space lines. But also, as soon as you overdo grappa, you have these artifacts. So if we would do better grappa, then we wouldn't have these artifacts and might be able to push grappa a bit further. But also grappa has these noise amplifications and these like the G factors. So we spent some time trying to figure out kind of the limits of grappa, and grappa is also not something that I'm a particular expert on. But there's a lot of literature out there, and it's really helpful for fMRI, specifically efficient fMRI. And when you look at the literature out there, and there are many review articles, it usually comes down to noise amplification, the G factor, as well as kind of how many channels you have. There's even now these editorials basically criticizing the overuse of high acceleration factors with respect to the limited number of elements that you have. So usually when people look at the limits of grappa, basically increasing it until it breaks, here going from kind of slice grappa 1 multiband 1 to 6, you can see that especially in the center of the brain, you have these noise amplifications. Also kind of with respect to the human connectome, I've studied, those are usually kind of in the center of the brain and the things that the neuroscientists kind of point finger to and say, oh, wait, we have a problem. The solution to this in the literature that I've understood is mostly kind of coming down to the size of the elements, how many elements you have, which basically ultimately limits the noise amplification. And there are a very strict parameterized mathematical models that basically predict where you would expect this noise amplification given your coil sensitivities and also your undersampling patterns. So let's look into that. We can do this as an exercise, basically grab a fully sampled 3D EPI with 200 slices and this kind of matrix size at 0.8 millimeter resolutions. And then you can see that to get those many slices, it just takes a lot of time. It takes about 40 seconds. That's not practical. But still for this exercise to understand the limits of grappa, and we use that data set and then we measure the G factor for a given undersampling pattern as we would get it at the scanner. For grappa, like no grappa, we don't have any G factor noise amplification. Then grappa 4, grappa 8, 12, 16, and 20. And you can see how the G factor, based on the models, would basically explode and we would have a lot of noise amplification. So assuming that 0.8 millimeter is thermal noise limited, we can basically predict where we have certain noise amplification and then see how the signal breaks down, right? And you can see that maybe after grappa 8, it starts to look really like salt, pepper, noisy. And then with grappa 20, images are certainly unusable. Now we have this simulation results, and we can then go to the scanner, 70B for us, and then basically see how this looks in practice, in empirical data, where everything looks kind of with grappa 4, grappa 8, their weirdness coming along, and then grappa 12, 16, 20, the signal completely breaks apart, right? It doesn't really look like the simulation though, right? We don't have all this kind of salt pepper noise that we would expect if we would be starting from a thermal noise limited data set. This data are still completely unusable, right? But it's different than expected, which is always kind of interesting and funny because then we can learn something and maybe improve something. So, and it gives us,
Renzo, quick
yes,
question.
yes.
This 3264 or 128 channel coil?
This is the standard Nova coil 32.
32. Okay.
Yes. I think almost everything I'm going to show you is 32. So a grappa 20 is really pushing it, right? Given the number of channels. Though, as you might know from, it is still funny how it breaks down, given that Steve Möller had a 60-channel coil with acceleration factor of 16 in the 2010 paper, right? Anyway, the take-home message here is that we have these artifacts, and we need to go through the hurtful business of basically looking at the ugly part of our data to trying to understand what is causing them. And I think we can classify some of these issues. Basically, we kind of see these low spatial frequency issues. Basically, we have these fuzzy ripples, as we call them, usually visible as kind of low spatial frequency smooth darkenings or brightenings. Like we have 20 voxels in diameter that are kind of darker, then 20 voxels brighter, darker, and this entire patch here is dark. And I have a question.
Oh yeah, I just want to let you know that I don't see slides up, just in case you meant to have slides.
Okay, I will stop sharing and start sharing again. Other people did see slides, did they?
Yep. Oh yeah.
Oh, then maybe it's a me issue. Never mind. Never mind.
I'm doing it again. Maybe it's coming up.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so we have our fuzzy ripples, these low spatial frequency artifacts, but also we have edge ghosts, specifically like here that like these stripes in the center of the brain usually are kind of from edge, sometimes fat related. And down here we also have this kind of nice arc, which is maybe 4 or 5 voxels thick, and it's kind of following the rim over there. On top of that, we have these very thin stripes. Very often kind of it's 1 voxel thick, and they are parallel, usually to the edge of the brain, and usually they are somewhat perpendicular to the read direction, which often is indicative of RAM sampling or resampling issues when you overdo RAM sampling too much. Maybe even better visible here at the edge of this turquoise circle where we have these parallel stripes over there. And then last but not least, everybody knows these off-resonance effects, specifically above the nasal cavities, where we have these interference patterns in areas where it's very hard to shim. So all of those things are not really specific to grappa, right? These are the usual suspects that we see in conventional EPI. We can get those artifacts without grappa. So I'm basically trying to work on those with the assumption or the axiom that grappa is basically an EPI problem amplification machinery, where we know in grappa or acceleration in general, we are skipping k-space lines or like in slice or in phase encoding direction, and this imposes aliasing patterns. And we know these aliasing patterns because we know which lines are skipped. So we impose known aliasing patterns, and then based on the coil sensitivities, we can unalias them, and based on this knowledge and the coil sensitivities. However, now imagine there's additional aliasing in there, for example, conventional 1/2 Nyquist ghosts. Then we have this unknown aliasing pattern, which is then basically amplified when grappa tries to unalias the image based on the coil sensitivities. So basically telling me the approach on how to fight those artifacts by trying to reduce the aliasing pattern in the base image as much as we can. So then the grappa can work more effectively. And I would talk about the mitigation strategies for each of those 4 that we've been working on, and I have 2 or 3 slides on each of them. So first of all, the fuzzy ripples, which we believe are largely caused by a third of the shims. And as you know, maybe the third order shims are part of the gradients. Like the gradients usually have two layers, the primary layer, the inner one, and then the shielding layer and the outside. And right between those, there are the third order shims. And when you look at the winding patterns of third order shims with respect to the gradients, you can see that they look very similar. There's a spatial symmetry in the geometry, right? And they're very close, so there can be coupling. And this has been also shown by Nicolas Ballon as part of their ramping up to 11 Tesla, where you can see that there are these short-term oscillation patterns very often in EPI. And by short-term, I mean anything kind of shorter than 1 millisecond. Like you have these oscillations. And this can be due to the fact that there are these varistors in the filter plates, voltage-sensitive resistors, which are part of the filtering mechanism. However, they allow this inductive coupling between the third order shims and the gradients, having these oscillations. So one obvious mitigation strategy would be to just unplug the third order shim, right? You can see that across different sequences, we always have these fuzzy ripples, these blobs of a kind of darkening or brightening. In fact, the brightening happens just as often. It's just harder to see. And as we unplug the third order shim, you can see that these artifacts just almost completely go away, right? Dark stuff over here goes away, or kind of the bright stuff over here goes away. The signal integrity improves. And this is not really something specific to our gradient set. Any kind of body gradient might have similar issues that has these third order shims in there. For example, on the NIMH Terra, we have these. On the NINDS Terra, we have these. But also on the 70 Plus, we have these. That here for the Siemens EP2D, we see that those artifacts go away as soon as we unplug the third order shim. So that's very helpful already. Next, let's look at the red stuff, the edge ghosts. And these edge ghosts are often associated with eddy currents, specifically short-term eddy currents. And I think all of you know that in EPI, we are acquiring the data with these trapezoidal shapes of the gradients. And I guess most of you also know that this is the nominal gradient shape. In real life, these amplifiers don't have unlimited power and they don't have unlimited spectrum. So therefore, while we want to have the solid line, usually what we get is the dotted line, which then needs to be accounted for. And specifically accounting mechanisms is that you assume that there's a delay, basically shifting it across time. But then you see that there are still these edges, right, at the increasing, like at the ramping of the trapezoidal shape. And this is not linear, right? This looks more exponential. So a conventional 2-parameter EPI Nyquist ghost correction cannot fully account for it. What can partly account for it would be eddy current compensation, which is part of the Siemens control mechanism of the gradients. And there's a specific tune-up procedure that's specific to each scanner and specific to each gradient of that scanner. Even like when you switch the gradient, this tune-up needs to be done. And there are like 4 parameters. There is a delay for each gradient direction, and there is a strength and a time course of this exponential decay. And actually there are 5 exponential parameters for each gradient direction. The issue, though, with this conventional Siemens tune-up is that it does not include short-term eddy currents. I don't know where the cutoff is in this algorithm of this tune-up, but across all the 7 Teslas, I've never seen a parameter shorter than 700 microseconds. So these very short-term eddy currents are not accounted for with this procedure. However, as part of the tune-up procedure, Siemens uses these kind of step gradient functions, basically a constant gradient on, then a linear slope down, and then a constant gradient off. And these data, while they are only analyzed in the low temporal domain, we can also look at them with the high temporal, like short-term components. Basically here, for example, for the X gradient, for the Terra, the NIMH Terra, you can see that there are these short-term eddy currents that are not accounted for with the conventional tune-up. You also see that some gradients, for example, the C gradient, does not really have this short-term problem to begin with. So together with Michael Köhler from the Siemens physics team, he looked at these tune-up data and then gave us eddy current parameters that we can plug in into the eddy current compensation method, which has the capability to also account for these shorter terms, but so far in the standard procedure just doesn't. And then we can see how much it improves our short-term eddy currents. Namely, here you can see that we have these edge ghosts that are kind of mostly gone away as soon as we including these short-term eddy currents. We can also try to use this knowledge to optimize our protocols. For example, knowing that the C gradients doesn't really have these short-term eddy currents that badly, we can also basically flip the redirection into the C gradients, and which then also improves our image integrity quite a bit here with Grappa 16, for example. However, note that as soon as you basically flip the redirection, everything else changes too, right? The coil alignment changes, everything changes. So this is maybe due to short-term eddy currents as well as other things, whereas this is literally just the short-term eddy currents. The next mitigation strategy that I tried to look at was these kind of very faint stripes, these ramp samplings, which very often look like these regridding problems when ramp sampling is not working perfectly. So we basically used our protocols and basically tried to get rid of ramp sampling. And for those who don't know what ramp sampling is, in EPI, usually we not only acquire the signal during the flat top of the gradients, but also kind of while the gradient is ramping up, which makes it slightly more efficient. However, if it's limiting us from doing Grappa, then it might be even more efficient to not use ramp sampling and then just increase Grappa a bit more if we don't have these artifacts that limit us so much. So just switching off ramp sampling, you can see that for going from the bottom case to the top case, that the mean EPI doesn't have a lot of these issues anymore. And also, if you just look at the ghost without the signal, we have less of these ghosting artifacts, interference patterns, but also in the TSNR, which for this huge field of view of 400 millimeters here, you can see that these kind of edge ghosts are mostly gone away. However, also here, it's kind of hard to really distinguish the ramp sampling from other issues. Namely, for this very protocol, a whole brain EPI protocol, in Maastricht still we acquired, like we looked at the scope system to see where we have the biggest errors in these from the nominal gradient pulse shape to the measured gradient pulse shape. And usually the biggest errors are coming right at the rising corner and the falling corner of these gradients. So when you look at the gradient error, it's usually right at the edges of the flat top. And when you do ramp sampling, then basically these eddy currents, that the short-term eddy currents that we have are kind of really part of your signal data. Whereas when we're not using ramp sampling, these huge errors are literally at the edge of our ADC, which is then usually suppressed anyway in the hunting filtering later anyway. So while it seems to help a lot to get rid of ramp sampling in these initial tests, there are these interactions with other sources of artifacts. Specifically also, if you don't use ramp sampling or you use ramp sampling, you have a different echo spacing. You can see that here we are slightly shorter. So to really pin down how much ramp sampling affects our data quality, I changed or reconfigured it in a way that I'm not only changing the ramp sampling, but then also I'm keeping the echo spacing identical. And here you can see this for two participants. So I'm showing you the mean EPI image, and I'm showing you the ghost magnitude only with ramp sampling and without ramp sampling for a case with third order and without third order. And I believe what I can see here is that we have these huge artifacts like coming from these larger ghosts. However, when we unplug the third order shim, these artifacts are mostly going away anyway across participants. So the fact that we had huge signal changes with and without ramp sampling might have probably been an interaction with changing the echo spacing. Ramp sampling alone doesn't really seem to be, as like empirically in those tests at least, a huge problem. Right. Last but not least, let's look at off-resonance effects, namely these interference patterns over there. And they're not only annoying with respect to distortions, but specifically also with respect to artifacts. And here I'm showing you a cartoon of where I think the problem comes from. So here you're seeing the phase error as we go through k-space in EPI sampling. So basically, if we have an off resonance, we have a different phase, and that accumulates as much time you spend acquiring data. So basically, at the start of your acquisition, you don't have any phase error. Then you go through one line, you have a bit of phase error, you go further and further and further, and the phase error accumulates. In the center of the read lines, we have a nice and smooth stepwise increase of this off resonance, basically imposing a gradient in there that we don't want to have, but it's not the end of the world. This is literally the course of the distortions, like spatial geometric distortions in our images, which we kind of know we have anyway, and we need to deal with, and we have good strategies to deal with that. It's not really the cause of these issues. The cause of these issues, however, more comes from the edge of these lines, because here we have no additional phase error every other line, right? And then we have a sudden jump. And when you have kind of these inconsistencies that are not smooth across your phase encoding direction, but only for every other line, you have Nyquist ghosting, specifically high spatial frequency Nyquist ghosting at the edge of the lines, right? And as you know, over the past 2 years, maybe, we played a lot with these dual polarity approaches to account for other sources of kind of Nyquist ghosting. And the original purpose of those dual polarity approaches, however, were really to account for those kind of artifacts with respect to segmentation. So as an exercise, let's look what happens with these phase errors as we flip our read polarity, not the phase polarity as all of us do for kind of top-up distortion correction, but let's flip the read polarity. So for one TR, we acquire data from left to right to left, right to left, and so on. And in the other one, we do left to right and then right to left. So if we take a complex valued average or sum of these two images, it is mathematically literally the same as if we would take an average of those two signals, right? If we just take the signal from all the red lines, make an image out of it, and all the blue lines separately make an image out of it, mathematically this must be the same, right? And in this case here, we don't have these sudden jumps between odd and even lines, so we shouldn't have these high spatial frequency errors to begin with. Telling us also that switching the read polarity literally inverts the ghost. We have the same signal, but the ghost is exactly opposite. So we can estimate the ghost during our time series or a session and then account for it within the data. And how this looks empirically is shown here for 2 participants, where you see all kind of things that are very wrong, but specifically also you see these interference patterns here in the front, usually above the cavities, kind of these little fine kind of phase inconsistency ripples. And you can see that they're completely opposite as I'm flipping back and forth between the redirection. This means that when I estimate this error and subtract half of it with the opposite sign of each of them, you can see that I'm getting nice and clean EPI data that, aside of the distortions, almost look like conventional theta star weighted GRE flash data. So there are multiple approaches how you can utilize this multipolarity. One approach that we are using right now a lot is, and Lasse Knudsen has implemented this as well in their studies, which is on GitHub to download, is basically flipping the read direction for each individual line, then only looking at the magnitude data, because the projection of the ghost to the magnitude should be completely like opposite as well. Then estimating basically the error field and then applying the half of the error field with alternating signs to odd and even TRs. There might be noise in the error over here, so there might be anti-correlation between odd and even TRs that is only coming from the noise, not the signal though. Other approaches are basically using this as a deconvolution, which I think is more described in Witzke van der Zwaag's paper on these dual polarity approaches. But in summary, we have talked about 4 different artifacts that make it hard to do whole brain layer dependent fMRI, and 4 different mitigation strategies. So now we can see if we can apply them all to get back to our frustratingly unusable signals with GRAPPA20. And we call this approach EPIC, which stands for Advanced Echoplanar Parallel Imaging with Gradient Harmonization. So basically, we optimize the gradients so we can do GRAPPA more effectively. And the 4 strategies involve using the short-term eddy currents in the Siemens ECC systems, unplugging the third order shim, not doing RAM sampling, which might not be really necessary now with the latest data anyway, and then also doing this dual polarity calibration. And then empirically, if we do all of this, we can see we end up with data like this on 70B here, where you can see that the artifacts kind of, they are there. If you really point your finger, you can always kind of find them somewhere. But the data look pretty usable, right? Up to a grappa 12, 16, and maybe a grappa 20, then these gigantic G factors really start to kick in. And then we are starting to be in this thermal noise dominated regime, and we have more of this salt pepper noise specifically in the center. Down there, you see the corresponding TSNR efficiency, where you see that for fully sampled 0.85 millimeter, I think it was, we are really in the physiological noise limited regime. Seeing kind of CSF being dark, and we have pulsation. TSNR efficiency increases as we go from grappa 4 to grappa 8. Maybe grappa 8 has the peak in the center of the brain and then it decreases again. If you look at the periphery, however, you can see that the highest TSNR efficiency is more in the range of 12 to 16 and then ultimately drops again with grappa 20. But this gives us TRs that we can certainly kind of use in kind of connectivity analysis for movie watching also. To show you the consistency, here's another participant with a slightly different protocol, where again, you can see if you just measure the G factor and simulate what the noise amplification would be, assuming that we would be only thermal noise limited, you can see that we have a lot of thermal noise unusable data. If we just do it right out of the box with the 3D API, you can see that the image artifacts are pretty bad, and specifically like in this section down there. However, if we use the EPIC approach, we can get much further to grappa 12, maybe 16, even in this specific case. As a test for applicability, I tried to use this in a task that engages the entire brain. This is not movie watching just yet. This is using this 0.8 protocol while using the task that also Hassar is using, namely an autobiographical memory task where participants need to find a memory and then press a button as soon as they found a memory in their recent past and then need to relive that memory. And it's counterbalanced with math equations. So you can see that the movie time series on the top left. So you see some pulsation over there, but you see that the image quality is pretty stable. And here I'm flipping back and forth how it would be with and without EPIC, basically with the third order shim or without the dual polarity while doing all of this. And because the TR is so short, and despite having a matrix 200 slices, it not only allows us to look at activity versus rest here for math versus autobiographical memory across the hippocampus and these attention networks, but also it allows us to look at different epochs during the activity trials, namely the people usually take a few seconds, maybe 4 seconds, to find a memory in their recent past. Then they need to press a button, and then they need to relive that memory. So you can see the attention network completely separate temporally from the motor network when they press the button. So I think we are getting there. And coming back to the big picture, where I want to do whole brain layer dependent fMRI, I think maybe we have a protocol now that we can try to use in the next Kenju 4.0 data set where we acquire the same person many times with a movie watching task to see whole brain layer connectivity, because the first tests seem to be promising. EPIC, you can also look at the data here to be completely honest, that you can kind of point fingers and see where in the brain, how deep, how the artifacts kind of come in. EPIC might not only be helpful for high resolution, but also for low resolution if you not want to push for kind of small voxels, but rather for if you're really desperate for short TRs, you can also use kind of here grappa 18 in order to get to very short TRs, which usually comes along with these kind of artifacts if you use grappa 18, even with 2 millimeters. However, if you use EPIC, then you can see that, I think this is a movie. Yes. Actually, you see some instability here because this is like the non-steady state where kind of basically you see the T1 going into equilibrium, which you can use according to Ravi's recent studies to boost your event-related designs as well. But the point here that I want to make is that we don't seem to be limited by thermal noise just yet. We don't have these holes in the center. We see that we have holes in the CSF, right? The stuff that's fluctuating. We're more physiological noise limited than thermal noise limited. And one potential application, and I'm not sure if there are many for these very short TRs, but one would be to kind of separate different time delays in resting state. For example, it has been shown that the default mode network actually consists of many subnetworks that have very similar time courses, resting state here, but they're slightly delayed, right? And then you can see that we can actually separate the red from the blue. which is just a tiny bit delayed. And sometimes it's more delayed. So you don't really need that high temporal resolution. As I learned from Burak, actually you can separate them also at lower temporal resolution. But if you really want to separate them always and more consistently, this might be an application case. I know here at NIH, many folks care about multi-echo, and not only here, in many places. So you can also use this approach to get multi-echo, but then at like not as high resolution, but still a kind of sub-second, because usually one thing that multi-echo users complain about is that the TR is not as short as HCP. So here, if you use Grappa 20 with a 2 millimeter isotropic and those kind of matrices, with that undersampling pattern, you can see that kind of maybe we are getting a bit more thermal noise limited, but still kind of in this TSNR regime, I think it looks pretty awesome. And I want to thank Jan Evans for kind of doing the first iteration of giving feedback on artifacts that we could solve now, I think. So if anybody wants to use that, those protocols exist. Talking about practical aspects, what are the disadvantages? And maybe one obvious disadvantage of disconnecting the third order shim is that you don't have these higher order shim terms, right? And it's kind of funny because the kind of coil builders, when you look at their talks or their books, in fact, Peter Dietz, they don't really seem to like third order shim like a lot to begin with. And it seems to be the user that usually demands them and kind of blindly think that more components must be better, and therefore let's force the vendor to give us a higher order shims. We want them. Without a lot of evidence that I could find that these higher order shim terms are particularly helpful for EPI, for fMRI, high resolution fMRI. So here I'm showing you data from 3 participants, and I'm flipping back and forth the 2 phase encoding direction, giving you an idea of the qualitative kind of distortions. And on the insets over there, you see the distortion field. And the top row is without the third order shim, the bottom row is with the third order shim, while using also these higher order third order shim points. So I guess that the obvious thing that you see is that there are huge distortions, right? No question. But they're pretty much huge anyway, right? If you use the third order shim or not. And maybe the next biggest thing that you see are these dark artifacts that we always have, which are not there when we unplug the third order shim. And just as reference, let's look at the slice selective field that we have with these third order shims. So without third order shims, we wouldn't have those distortion components on a slice or slab selective basis. And in fact, we only have 4 components of the third order shims anyway. And you can see that the distortion fields don't really match any of those kind of fields anyway. It's not the c squared x or the c x squared minus y squared or the c squared y. So even with those, the power of having these kind of distortions, all these distortion patterns cannot be accounted for anyway. So I don't really see any disadvantage of disconnecting the third order shim for the high resolution EPI for that matter. The other kind of maybe disadvantage that you might want to consider when using EPIC is that you need to tell the system that it now doesn't have a third order shim. And it doesn't have any implications for safety, even though some sites are worried about that. Like you can buy a FDA-approved Terra without the third order shim. Having the third order shim has nothing to do with the FDA approval. The so-called Zeichnungsstand, as the Siemens folks call it, is the same, right? So you just need to configure your system to tell it that you don't have the third order shims because it will have an effect on the second order shim. And this configuration requires a password and is a maybe 15 minutes procedure because it requires a full reboot. So it is a bit annoying. In order to make it a bit more user-friendly, specifically here at NIH, we basically have different configurations on the PTX and the STX console. You know that for the 2 systems that we manage, 70A and 70B, we always have the PTX and the STX. And even though, like on the PTX, you don't need to use PTX, right? In fact, almost all of the data that I showed you were acquired in STX CP mode while using the PTX system. So the PTX is now configured in a way that it does not assume that there are third order shims. And so the only thing that you need to do when you want to get rid of the third order shims is basically switch from STX to PTX, which takes about 5 minutes or so. You need to press a button in the control room, one in the machine room, and then you can unplug the third order shim without worries. And it does not require a full reboot. So this makes it much more convenient to basically use EPIC without the third order shims, but not really sacrificing a lot of your allocated scan time. the business with the short-term eddy current configuration is a bit more tricky. We still haven't figured out everything, and I guess ultimately we want to use these short-term eddy currents on the entire system for anything that's run on those systems anyway. But there are a few more tests that need to be done to be really sure that it's always an improvement to use them. And in fact, as soon as you change the eddy current, you need to redo the calibration for the delays, which is an entire procedure. You need to do a kind of consistency, like temporal stability check, which usually comes down to 2-3 hours of kind of retune up features that depend on these short-term eddy current compensations. So I don't advise anybody to play with this just yet. It also requires yet another password that's a bit more harder to get. So if you want to use Epic, I would propose to rather use the dual polarity approach that accounts for these short-term eddy currents just as well. And with this, I specifically want to thank those folks, Tyler, Hui, Alex, and Burak are users of the Epic and kind of giving feedback and kind of testing the applicability of these kind of Grappa 16 protocols. Specifically, Lasse and Rudy were particularly helpful with respect to the dual polarity calibration approach, with the newest insight that we don't really need the complex valued averaging. Magnitude is just fine, and you can use it kind of dynamically or across runs, where Lasse provides a few scripts with that. And with this, I thank you for your attention. Are there any questions?
Renzo, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Yeah, nice work. So you simulated the 20-fold Grappa, and it looked a lot noisier than your measured 20-fold Grappa. Do you have an explanation for that?
Like, I believe that, like in the simulation, I'm not simulating physiological noise, obviously. So basically, if I take the fully sampled image and then basically kind of simulate how it would look, given the assumption that the fully sampled image would be 100% thermal noise limited. So the fact that it doesn't look so noisy tells me that at 0.8 millimeter for a fully sampled whole brain image, we are not even close to the thermal noise limit yet. That's my explanation.
Okay. Have to think about that.
Yeah, sort of related question to Jeff's question. So how are you measuring your Grappa kernels? Is it with Fleet or is it Flash or what? Or does it make a difference? What's your experience there?
Wait, how I measure the Grappa kernel? The ACS.
You can do an EPI measurement. You can do a Flash measurement. You can do all these.
We tried 3 approaches. I think we at the end, most of those data are acquired with Fleet. Like they're segmented and Fleet in the 3D EPI are kind of the same thing anyway. It's basically just a looping structure. So anything segmented is implicitly Fleet. We tried that. We tried GRE, and specifically in GRE, you have different distortions. So we also, both of them, we acquired 2 sets of ACS, 2 sets of autocalibration data, where the polarity is flipped. This is not a dual polarity Grappa yet, so for that matter. So we acquire, in the data that you all showed, I acquired segmented, but I acquired it twice. And then the segmented EPI that I have fully sampled to train the Grappa kernel is segmented with opposing repolarities and then just averaged before the Grappa kernel training starts. So it's not, I don't have 2 kernels. I have 1 kernel that is trained on the dual polarity averaged reference image. But it is segmented. We tried this with GRE, also with the GRE with two polarities, which should be better, but empirically, it's not. And the ghosting is usually like identical. It's just that temporal stability seems to be a bit better when I use the API, and I don't know why.
Depending upon how long your ACS line acquisition is, I mean, physiologic variation is going to take part. And if that's not consistent with the actual EPI volumes, then you'll always have some mismatch between the calibration lines and the EPI volumes. So,
That, yeah, the echo
the
time is also.
faster you acquire those lines, probably the better from a temporal stability point of view, even though there may be other distortions that aren't as good. But
Yeah. I'm also worried about fat a bit because it's much brighter in the cherry. Ultimately, I use a relatively small kernel, not the default in the icepad ini, and also I'm doing quite a bit of over regularization in the grapper kernel fit, which is also not the default in the icepad ini file. And I'm using a functor from Philip Eses for that, to give him credit.
I have a small one. This this dual polarity correction, how different is from just the signal intensity correction? I mean, I know you take account this difference, but you know, to my experience, the artifact is not changing volume to volume. So maybe if how does it perform if you just remove the main field in the background?
I think Steve Möller implemented that very approach based on our abstract with just an intensity protection, basically having an image with the opposite polarity and then basically adding that on top of the time series. It still doesn't, like if you have a lower signal, you have lower SNR, and then it's just adding it makes the image look nicer, but doesn't really boost your TSNR for that matter. Apparently, this is how Bruker does it, he says. There are multiple approaches. Like I think that the TSNR problem can be accounted for if you're right, and the artifact is really stable across time. Then you can use the approach that I think we used with the Hassar data, namely having one run with one polarity where you have a TSNR drop in certain areas, and then you use another run in the opposite polarity, and because the timing of the task is identical, you average those. I found that there is a small component temporal unstable as well. Like for example, when you have respiration, you have differences in the phase, and then the ghost that interferes can be interfering constructively and destructively. And so if the spatial pattern of your P0 is different across time, then also the ghost is temporally unstable across time. It doesn't seem to, like I don't see this a lot, like that the zeroth order and B0 drifts don't seem to be stronger than the spatial drifts that are responsible for the constructive or destructive interference there. What we did at the beginning was basically having complex valued averaging of pairs of TRs. And that turned out to be not ideal because like you have these phase differences between different TRs, and then when the phase is different and you add them complex value, then it actually introduces instabilities because like you would have for a segmented EPI. So basically you would do a kind of a flyback, like interleave flyback EPI, where you take all the odd lines from one TR, all the even lines from the other TR, and then merge them, which then are acquired across different respiration cycles. So it turned out that this doesn't seem to be very effective. So the most effective approach was the kind of having the sliding window of 3 TRs, estimating the error, and only the error, and then applying the error, like half the error to the center image. So it's basically like assuming that you have the error that's kind of temporally unstable, but you assume that it's not changing so much within pairs of 3, which might be a good assumption, maybe not. I don't know. Yeah. Empirically, that was the most effective one, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if changes in time, yeah, you need to take in account. Also, like the artifact is not much changing from grappa 12 to 16, but the number of volumes is 25% more. Would that give you a gain in task-based layered fMRI?
I don't know. It depends. Like TR is as a parameter you pay a price for, and then I don't like. I would definitely say that grappa 16. It's not as great as grappa 12, right? If you don't need to go to the TRs of 2.4, what it was for grappa 16, then don't go there. If you're fine with 3 seconds for grappa 12, I think. The artifacts are still like, especially down there. And that's why I had all the 3 axes, but it was small. Maybe you couldn't see it there. It's not as perfect for grappa 16 as it is for grappa 12. So if you don't need to go that fast, then don't. But usually people really prefer that fast. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. If there are no further questions, I thank you all. And as a reminder, next in 2 weeks, there will be a holiday. So we will see you again in 4 weeks. And then we will talk about, I think, epilepsy with layers fMRI from Fraser. All right. Bye-bye.